Once again, here we are ready to go with our Bible study. So we'll start it in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord in heaven, we are now about to finish 2 Samuel. We're making great progress on your Old Testament. And we ask you to be with us today to open our hearts to your words and our minds to the truth that you're trying to teach us. And we ask all of this through Jesus Christ, your Son. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So, as always, on to share screen. And we will start 2 Samuel right after we do our review. So, someday you guys are going to thank me for this, because this is how you are going to remember all the stories of the Old Testament. I'm not going to explain any of them now, because you should start to have words come into your head as you hear this from all the times I've explained it. So this week we'll just do it as the little kind of limerick that it is. Creation, fall, flood, nations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Redemption, revelation, sacrifice, sanctification. Tribes, tragedy, transition. Coverage, commands, covenant. Conquest, settlement, cycles. Love. Samuel, Saul, David. United, right? That is where we left off. These last three, Samuel was the last judge of Israel. He made Saul, anointed Saul, the first king, the first Christ of Israel, right? The anointed one. Saul turned out to be not such a great king, so he was replaced by David. And under David, first David became the king of Judah, we learned last week, and then he became the king of all of Israel. So now all 12 tribes, when we start our readings today, are united under David. So God makes a covenant with David. He says to David that chapter 7 starts out with David going to Nathan the prophet and saying, hey, Nathan, I want to build a house for God, right? The king of Tyre sent cedars from Lebanon so that David himself could have a house in Jerusalem, because David had kicked all the pagans out of Jerusalem and made it his capital. It became the city of David. And now David wants to repay God, basically. He wants to build God a place for the ark to rest instead of having this portable meeting tent. And at first Nathan says, yeah, good. Yeah, that sounds good to me. But God comes to Nathan and he says, not so, not so. Here, let me tell you what I am going to give David. And so the Lord tells David that he is going to make David a great name, which he does, right? Jerusalem is still called the city of David. The six-pointed star that represents it is the Star of David. None of us have forgotten David's name. God said that he would appoint a place for his people Israel, where never again would they be subject to the people who want to kill them and to hurt them. And of course, David in his mind, he doesn't know about Jesus, who's coming hundreds of years later. So he's thinking that Israel is going to be safe from all these different tribes once all the fighting is done. But that's not really God's covenant with him. The place that he is going to make for Israel is going to be heaven, right? And that's going to be when Jesus opens up the gates of heaven after he's crucified. But that's part of the covenant with David. He says, your offspring will build me a house. And now he's talking back near the time of David, right? It was David who wanted to build him a house, but God is instead going to have Solomon build the temple there in Jerusalem. And God tells him that his kingdom is going to be established forever, David's kingdom. And, so David's thinking, oh, this is awesome. He doesn't know again about Jesus, the final king, not just of Israel, but of the world, right? He sends the apostles out to preach the name of Jesus and the story of God to all nations. And so that's going to be the kingdom that's established forever. And then God says to him that you wanted to build me a house, but I will build you a house. And again, once we know the New Testament, we know that the house that gets built for David is the church. That Christ leaves us, he returns to heaven to sit at his Father's right hand, but the church remains here and Christ remains with the church in the Holy Eucharist. And so there's this amazing covenant that's made with David, and David goes to prayer to God afterwards. He realizes what an amazing thing it is to have God make this covenant with him and to make his name eternal. So that's chapter 7. Chapters 8 through 10 is David making a name for himself. And the first thing that he does is he defeats a bunch of his enemies that we've heard about before, the Philistines, the Moabites. He goes out with his army, Joab at the head of it, right? Joab's the commander of his army. And Joab and Abishai and the leaders of his people, his army, defeat all these enemies with King David at their head. And then remember Mephibosheth? Mephibosheth was this guy who was named last lesson. He was the young son of Jonathan, Saul's son. And Jonathan and King David were like brothers. They loved each other tremendously. Jonathan had this son, Mephibosheth. And when all of the problems started happening with Saul and Saul was killed, Mephibosheth's nurse ran away with him to keep him safe, but she drops him along the way and injures his feet so that he can never walk right again. And God comes to David and he tells him that he has to make atonement for Saul's death, right? Saul was anointed. David didn't kill him, but Saul ends up dying. And in order to make this atonement, King David finds Mephibosheth. And you can see here, this man is helping Mephibosheth kneel in front of King David. And King David gives him all that belonged to his grandfather, Saul. So then Joab, we get a story about another battle. Joab defeats the Ammonites and scares off the Syrians. Just another example of Joab trusting God, right? They go into this battle, he and Abishai, and they are not sure that they can win it. But Joab puts his trust in God. And, he says, if this is God's will, we will. And they defeat the Ammonites, and the Ammonites kept calling in the Syrians to help them. And the Syrians decided that was probably a losing proposition because God was with Israel. So in chapter 11, we learn about David betraying his command, right? He's now made a great name for himself by defeating all these enemies. He's got a united Israel under him. But one of the most important things about a commander is to his army as God is to his people, right? He is supposed to be the shepherd of his army. He's supposed to care for them. And the very first sentence of chapter 11 tells us that in the springtime is when the king leads his army out to do battle with his enemies. Well, David remains in Jerusalem instead of leading his men into battle, which is immediately a bad commander. And then he sees one of his soldiers, Uriah the Hittite. He sees his wife bathing, right? Here she is on her rooftop bathing. Here's King David leering at her from his balcony. She's tremendously beautiful. So he has his servants go over and get Bathsheba and bring him to her. And, she is probably smitten with the fact that the king of Israel wants to sleep with her. So she does. And she gets pregnant. And as soon as she's pregnant, David realizes, wow, I have really made a mistake. I have a soldier out there and I have betrayed his confidence. The commanding officer has slept with his soldier's wife. So he decides that he is going to call Uriah home. And he does. And this is what he thinks. If I call Uriah home, then Uriah is going to come to Jerusalem. He's going to go to his house. He's going to sleep with his wife. And then he'll think he's the father of this baby. But when Uriah gets to Jerusalem, he is a loyal soldier. And he knows that Joab and the army are still out there on the front lines fighting. And he won't betray his brothers in arms. So he doesn't go to his house and he doesn't sleep with his wife. And so David is told, so he thinks of another plan. He's like, okay, I'll have Uriah come to dinner and I'll get him drunk. And once he's drunk, then he'll go to his beautiful wife. He'll sleep with her and he'll think he made her pregnant. Well, he gets Uriah drunk, but Uriah again does not betray his brothers in arms. He doesn't go to his house. So David goes to step 3. He writes a note to Joab, the head of the army, and he gives this note to Uriah, and in the note it says, send Uriah to the heaviest place of fighting, and then withdraw all the rest of the army from there, and let Uriah be killed. And Joab follows the instructions of his commander. He does exactly that. He puts Uriah out in the heaviest area of fighting, and he pulls back men, and Uriah is killed along with some of the other soldiers. And then he goes to send word back to King David. And, the soldier who's going to take this word back, he couldn't figure out what Joab was doing, because Joab was getting close to a wall where he should have never been, never sent his soldiers. And now he's going to have to explain this to the king, who's going to be furious. And Joab says, oh yeah, at the end, tell him that Uriah died in the fighting. It'll be okay, wink, wink, right? So he has him killed. And then Bathsheba finds out, she mourns her husband, but King David comes, takes her as his wife, and she has a son for King David. And the chapter ends with saying the Lord was not pleased, right? And in chapter 12, he reads the riot act to David through Nathan the prophet. Nathan the prophet is told to go and tell a parable to King David, a parable of a rich man. And this rich man is David, right? The rich man owns all these sheep. He has a huge flock. And there's a poor man too, and the poor man only has one single sheep. It's a little ewe. And the poor man, Uriah, he feeds his little sheep at his own table. He gives it morsels of food. He raises it with his family so that this little lamb is a part of his family. And then the rich man has a traveler that comes to see him. And the traveler needs to eat. And instead of the rich man taking one of his many sheep and slaughtering it and giving it to him for dinner, he goes out and gets the poor man's one single sheep that has been raised as a member of the family, and he slaughters it, and he gives it to his traveling guests to eat. So Nathan tells him this story without saying it's a parable, and the king is furious, and he says, the rich man has to die, and he has to give fourfold what he took from the poor man. And then Nathan tells him, you, King David, are the rich man. You took the wife of your soldier. You took this ewe away from your soldier and you defiled her. And then you killed him, right? And so all of a sudden, David's eyes are open to his own sin. And there's a consequence to that. The Lord tells David that his wives are going to be given away to his neighbor and that Bathsheba's child will die. And David is dumbstruck, and he immediately starts longing to keep this child alive. He loves it. It's his son. And he loves Bathsheba, or lusts after her at least, right? He's already gathering about him a whole stable of wives, but he loves this son. And so he lies prostrate and stops eating, and he begs the Lord that he die instead of this infant son of his. But after 7 days, the little boy dies. And when he dies, David takes off the sackcloth, puts his clothes back on, washes, bathes, orders food, right? He's eating now. And people are like, they're all watching him, and they're like, what, why are you doing this now? Your son just died. And I love David's words, which I put over here. He says, but now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me, right? David knows that he will not meet this son again. And so he breaks the fast. He realizes that God's will is that his child die as a consequence of his sin. So he tries to change God's mind. It's to no avail. But Bathsheba also is, of course, mourning the loss of her son. And so David goes to her. They have relations. She bears another son. And the son is a beloved one of God. That's what the name Solomon means. And so God brings good out of David's evil. But in chapter 13, we learn that there's more trouble in David's family. Absalom is one of David's sons, and as is Tamar, one of his daughters, and they are full brother and sister. Their mother is Mahabat Talmai. And so they are full brother and sister, and they have, right, David's got a whole stable of wives. So they have a half brother, and the half brother's name is Amnon. And Amnon's mother is Ahinoam of Jezreel. And we remember her from last week's story because do you remember Nabal? Nabal was kind of a nasty man that David went to. He'd protected his flocks out in the wilderness. But when he goes to Nabal to get some food, Nabal disses him. And it's Abigail, Nabal's wife, that placates David and feeds him and feeds all of his men, and David doesn't take any action against Nabal, but God does, and Nabal dies. And David took Abigail for his wife, along with Ahinoam of Jezreel. And so Amnon is her son, and Amnon falls in love with Tamar. He just lusts after her. He has to have her. So he goes to a friend and he says to this friend, you know, Tamar's not paying really any attention to me and I'm in love with her. And his friend says, well, here, let me tell you what to do. Pretend that you're sick and go to your father, King David, and ask him to send Tamar to you to nurse you back to health. And then ask her to make cakes for you. And then when she makes those cakes for you, ask her to come into the bedroom to give them to you. And then take her. And so Amnon does it. He gets his father to send Tamar to him. He has her make cakes. He calls her into the bedroom. And then he grabs her to force her to have sex with him. And she, you know, she's like, don't do this. I am a virgin and you'll defile me. And in the meanwhile, you also will bring hatred to your own name, right? Don't just go to my father David and he will give you to me, right? Or give me to you. And back then the rules of incest were not the same. And so Tamar is like, he'll do that. But Amnon can't break from his lust and he rapes her. And so she's defiled. And here is a picture of Absalom, her brother who loves her, comforting her after she's been raped by Amnon. And so Absalom bides his time, but he is furious over the rape of his sister, who he's now brought into his house because she's been defiled, but he still loves her. So he brings her into his house so that she has a place to live. And he waits a couple of years, and then he has a big sheep shearing party. He goes to his father and he says, hey, Dad, I got all these shearers coming to shear this huge flock of ours. Let's make it a party. Come along with us. And all my brothers. And King David's like, nah, you know, I got other stuff to do, but I will send all the rest of my sons. And so all of King David's sons get there, and Absalom has his men kill Amnon. And word gets back to David that all of his sons have been killed by Absalom, but others reassure him it's not all of them. Absalom just killed Amnon because he raped Tamar. And so David weeps for Amnon, right? It's also one of his sons. He loves the son, and he's mad at Absalom. So Absalom goes away. I think I probably didn't even put it in the last slide, but Absalom runs away for a couple of years. And then Joab realizes that the king's heart is yearning for his son Absalom. So Joab comes up with a plan. He decides that he's going to use a wise woman from Tekoa to convince David to bring Absalom home. So he gives her this story to tell King David. She's going to go to him and she's going to tell him this heartbreaking story about two sons that she had, and one son killed another, and her husband's dead. She's a widow. And this only son who killed her other son is now being hunted by other people, and now she's going to lose her only son. And King David listens to all of this, and he's like, well, I'll protect your son. Your remaining son, I will make sure he doesn't get killed. And then this widow says, oh, well, thanks a lot, but now let me relate this to your life, right? She's the fixer woman, and she, is basically says, you're in the exact same situation. You have a son who killed another son. And David sees through it, and he asks her, did Joab set you up for this? And she's like, oh yeah, he did. He gave me the words. But King David has listened to her. He gets Joab's line. He's been yearning for Absalom anyway. So he says to Joab, tell my son that he can come home, but he can't come into my presence. And so he doesn't go into his dad's presence for 2 years. But then Absalom wants to actually talk to his father. He wants to see him again. And so he sends a message to Joab, and Joab ignores him. And so he sends another message, and Joab ignores him. So then he lights Joab's barley field on fire, which gets Joab's attention. And Joab makes a date with him to see his father. And his father sees his son Absalom, and he kisses him, right? He loves this son. He forgives this son for what he's done. And we also get a little description of Absalom. We're told that he is a tremendously beautiful man, very, very handsome. And part of his handsomeness is this hair that is just gorgeous, right? He ties it up on his head because it's so full and so beautiful. Kind of reminds me a lot of now our football players who always seem to have quite the head of hair and make advertisements for shampoo. Absalom would have fit right in with them. But Absalom, right? He killed one of David's other sons, and now he's going to steal the throne from him. He comes home. He's back in his dad's good graces. He goes out, he buys a bunch of chariots, he has a bunch of servants. And what he does is he goes out to the gate of Jerusalem. And as people are coming in, right, King David is still, he is now a king over the people, but he's still a judge for all the major cases. So when these elders of Israel come to bring cases before King David, Absalom stops them at the gate. And he's like, oh, tell me, what is it that you're coming to see the king for? Oh, I should be the judge of that. If I were the judge, right? He's basically bribing them to realize that he would be a better judge than his father. And by telling them that he would give this great justice to them, i.e., he'd give them whatever they wanted, were he the king. So he steals their hearts away. Well, so he does this for 4 years, and then he gets his dad's permission to go to worship in Hebron, right? He says, oh, I really, really, really wanted to come home, and Yahweh let me come home, and now I want to go to Hebron and tell Yahweh how happy I am. I want to offer him sacrifices in Hebron, which is kind of weird because the Ark of the Covenant's in Jerusalem. So why would you want to go to Hebron? But his dad tells him, okay, you can go. So Absalom goes, and he takes 200 unsuspecting men with him. They have no idea what his plan is. And what he does is he starts telling all these people, when I blow the trumpet, say that Absalom is the king of Israel. And he's already bribed all these guys. They want him to be king. And so he also calls his David's counselor Ahithophel to him. And so now he's got these 200 men. He's got Ahithophel, and he's blowing the trumpet that he's the king of Israel. Well, there are some of those 200 men who sneak back away from the camp so that they can go and warn King David what his son has done. So David flees from Jerusalem. And two of his priests who are still loyal to him, Zadok and Abiathar, they bring the Ark of the Covenant to the gate. They are ready to leave with David and all of his followers. And David says, no, no, the ark stays here. If it's God's will, I will return here, but the ark belongs in Jerusalem. And so these two loyal priests stay there. And then he also has Hushai the Archite stay in Jerusalem too. And he specifically tells him, I want you to be a spy for me. You will be my eyes in Jerusalem. I am going to head out to the wilderness with these followers of mine, with my family. And he also leaves 10 concubines there in Jerusalem. Now, in this picture, I just thought this was interesting because this is the Tel Dan stele. Steles were pieces of rock that in the ancient world they wrote on because they knew that rock was permanent. So they would write historical stuff on it. And on this stele, right here in the white chalk, what that does is mentions the house of David. And when I saw it, I thought, there are so many people in today's world who say the Bible is a myth, that it's not historically true at all. It's just this made up story. But that's not true. These steles were made by tribes other than Israelites. And the steles mention in this particular one, the house of David, and they mention names of kings and other steles. And so just a reminder that we really are studying history within the Bible. In chapters 16 and 17, the plot thickens, right? Absalom is now in Jerusalem, and David is on the run. He's headed for the wilderness. And so Ziba, who is the servant of Mephibosheth being the son of Jonathan, the one that David gave all of Saul's land to, Ziba comes on a donkey and has all sorts of food for David and his family. And when David asks, well, where is Mephibosheth? Ziba says, well, he decided to stay in Jerusalem because he thinks he can get an even better deal from Absalom than he did from you. And while this is occurring, there's a guy who's standing there just cursing David and throwing dust at David. And he's acting like a crazy man. Shimei, who curses David, or Shimei, you can say it either way. So Shimei curses David, and some of the men that are with David want to go over and kill him. But David realizes, he's not pleased God. Maybe this is really justice for some of the sins that he's committed. And so he says, no, you leave him alone. Perhaps he is cursing me because I deserve it. And so back in Jerusalem, Absalom asked Ahithophel, who was the counselor for David, what should I do? And so Ahithophel gives him his counsel. He says, go have sex with your father's 10 concubines. And so Absalom goes up to the rooftop. He has a tent built. And then in front of all of Israel, he has sex with his father's concubines, which, of course, what did God say to David was going to happen because of his sins? He said that his wives would be given to his neighbors, and his neighbor in this case happens to be his son, Absalom. And he also gives him the advice not to go out with his army, but to send his army out, Absalom's army out, and to kill only David. Don't kill the rest of the people, because once you kill David, they'll all turn back to you anyway. They kind of liked you anyway. You made them all these promises. And So Absalom says, well, let me ask Hushai to give me counsel too. And Hushai doesn't say anything about the concubines, but he does say, David's too smart for what Ahithophel just said to do. David won't spend the night with his people. He'll go and hide. And so you won't be able to find him anyway. You need to go out personally with your army and fight King David and his men. And when you win, then you will have no more problem. And so David is warned by Hushai, right? Because Hushai is his spy in Jerusalem. He sends somebody to warn David what's happening. And Absalom decides to take Hushai's counsel, not Ahithophel's. So Ahithophel sees the writing on the wall and he just decides to off himself. So he commits suicide. In chapter 18, we have the story of Absalom going up against King David's forces. So King David has put Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite in the head of his army. So they split the army up into three, and they come up with their plan about how to fight Amasa, who's leading Absalom's army. And David tells these three leaders of his army, go gently with my son. He still loves Absalom. There's that tie between father and son that is not broken. So Absalom's got this beautiful hair, and here's a little German miniature of what happened to him. He's riding a donkey out into battle, and his hair gets caught in an oak tree. And so he's just hanging in this oak tree. He can't get his hair out. And a Cushite sees him there and goes back and tells Joab, hey, Joab, Absalom is hanging from an oak tree. And Joab says, well, kill him, go kill him. And he's like, oh, I heard King David tell you three leaders that you're supposed to go easy with Absalom. And so I'm not doing it. And Joab is like, fine, don't do it. I will. So he takes 3 darts, he shoots Absalom, and then he has the rest of his men finish killing him. So Absalom is now dead. Joab has no remorse about it, but King David is heartbroken when he sees or when he hears, right? The Cushite is the first one who there's a son of, I think it was Zadok, one of the high priests. His son wanted to run to tell King David what happened, but Joab is like, no, let's go ahead and send the Cushite instead. So the Cushite starts out running for Jerusalem so he can tell, or running for King David. King David's not in Jerusalem, he's out in the wilderness. So the Cushite's running to King David to tell him that Absalom has been defeated. And, but then this second runner is like, no, send me too. So Joab says, okay, you can go too. You can be the second one to tell him. But he's a really good runner, so he outruns the Cushite. King David's watching. He realizes when he sees the first man running that he's got a messenger, he's got news. So the first runner comes to him and he says, we won. You are going to be the king again. And David immediately asks, well, what about my son? And he's like, well, as I was taking off, I saw this big kind of disruption, but I don't know what happened. Well, then David sees the second runner coming, the Cushite, and he asks him what happened. And he tells him that Absalom is dead. And so David is heartbroken when he hears it. And in chapter 19, we hear about David weeping for Absalom, his son. And he weeps and weeps. Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son Absalom, right? And Joab is furious because all of King David's men put their life on the line to defeat this army that was going to usurp and ultimately kill King David. And essentially, what David is doing by mourning his son is spitting in the face of the people who've saved him. So Joab rebukes him for doing that and tells him, get your act together and go lead your people. And so David does that. He stops weeping and he goes to the front gate and he meets with the elders of Israel. And he makes peace first with Judah. Judah was always kind of on his side, and Judah's the first one who meets him at the river to greet him and to have him come back into Jerusalem. And then he replaces Joab with Amasa, right? Amasa was the leader of Absalom's army. And so this is a real slap in the face to Joab. And so he does some other things too. David is a peacemaker. That is how he united Jerusalem. So he forgives Shimei for cursing him and throwing dust at him. And he makes peace between Ziba and Mephibosheth, because when he sees Mephibosheth and asks him, why didn't you leave Jerusalem with us? Because you were eating at my table. You were like my son. Mephibosheth said, well, I can't walk, and I sent my servant, i.e. Ziba, to get the donkey, and he never came back. And so Mephibosheth is torqued at Ziba, and David could have ordered that Ziba be killed for doing this, but instead what he decides is that the two of these people will split Saul's land, right? He had given Ziba all of Saul's land and possessions because he thought Mephibosheth had dissed him. But when he finds out what the real story is, he just splits Saul's things between the two and makes peace between them. And then Judah and the other tribes quibble over David, right? Judah's the first one to meet him and help him come back across the river to come to Jerusalem. But then all the other elders of all the other tribes come and say, well, David, he's just as much ours as he is yours, right? He is the king of all of Israel. And so they kind of start this fight amongst themselves for King David. And so in chapter 20, we read about another rebellion because one of the Benjamites, Sheba, he doesn't want to be a servant of King David. He's just like, well, let's not make him king, right? Let's revolt against him. Let's us become me, the king of Israel. And so he leads this rebellion against David. And David sends out Amasa, his new commander of his army, with the troops. And Amasa happens to run into Joab because Joab is now disguised himself. And he looks just like another soldier. And so he acts like a soldier who's coming up to kiss his commander. But instead he takes a knife and he kills him. And he actually just wounds him and he lies in his own blood. And a bunch of the troops come up and they pick Amasa up and they move him off the road. And then they decide, I think we best follow Joab here. And Joab's going after Sheba the Benjamite anyway, because Joab is still loyal to David, even though David doesn't really like him. So Joab gets to this town, Abel Beth Maachah, and he is just going to storm the gates and the wall of the city, and he's going to knock it down. And then he's going to go in and kill all the people inside, because that's how they fought wars back then. But there is a wise woman who comes out of the gate, and she meets Joab, and she says, I am not really interested in politics. I don't care who the king is. I just don't want this town to be destroyed, right? This is our home. And she says, what is it that you want, that you're knocking down our gates and getting ready to knock down our walls? And Joab says that they want Sheba the Benjamite. And I get kind of, it's amazing to me that it's Sheba who's a Benjamite, because he hates King David and he wants to usurp his power. And when we get to the New Testament, St. Paul is a Benjamite, and St. Paul hates Jesus in the beginning, right? And he wants to kill all of the Christians. And in fact, he's there when the first martyr, St. Stephen, is stoned to death. And then the scales fall from Paul's eyes. And well, Sheba was also a Benjamite. And so this wise woman, she deals with Joab, and she goes back inside. She finds Sheba. She has the people decapitate him. And then she throws his head over the wall to Joab, and Joab leaves, because that's all he wanted, was to stop the rebellion. And it was stopped for him by the wise woman. So then in chapters 21 through 24, we get a long story of royal successions. They're basically what we have in chapters 21 through 24, and it'll actually go into First Kings also. We basically have appendices to the stories, and they're not particularly enlightening, but you know, we are told about the famine that strikes King David's people, and we learn that it's because Saul mistreated the Gibeonites, and that's what's causing the famine. And so David the peacemaker goes to the Gibeonites, and he's like, you know, I know Saul mistreated you in this battle, and what is it that we could do to appease you? And they're like, well, give us 7 of Saul's descendants so that we can hang them. And that would appease us. And so King David does. And we're told that he doesn't give them Mephibosheth. But then they list the 7 descendants that they give him, and Mephibosheth's name is in there. So it's not quite clear who the 7 of Saul's descendants were. We know 6 of them, but the 7th is kind of questionable. And when they're given to the Gibeonites and killed, then the famine stops. And then we're told about more wars with the Philistines. And King David, his men win. He doesn't go out to battle with them anymore, because they tell him, you know, you're the king, and that's who they really want to kill, is the king. And so don't go out with us, just let us fight the battles. They did fight them, they won them. And then we get a very heady song of victory by King David. Heady in that it describes God and God's mercy beautifully. But David doesn't really describe himself very accurately in his song, right? He talks about how pure he is and how sinless he is. And you're going like, David, have you read these previous chapters? Do you remember that story about Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite? And but at any rate, it is a beautiful song of victory insofar as God is concerned, and God's raising up of this people. And then we read David's last words, and it includes 30 of the champions of Israel. And it's surprising kind of to me that the last name on the list of the 30 champions that David recognizes as Israel's champions is Uriah the Hittite, the man who he had killed because he made his wife pregnant. So And then we have the story of the unholy census. At first, we're told that the Lord is the one who told David to take the census. But I think David knows in his own mind that that was what they did back then in Israel. They attributed all their decisions to God. This is what God wants me to do. This is what the Lord Yahweh wants me to do. Well, Joab, as soon as he hears that David wants a census, censuses were not looked kindly upon by Yahweh in general because it's God's prerogative to have as many people in whatever tribes as he wants. Population control is God's picture, not man's picture. And so Joab doesn't want to do it, but David insists. So Joab and a bunch of the other army go out there and they count Israel. But when they bring it back to David and tell him the number, David suddenly realizes that he has sinned against God, because I think in his heart he always knew the Lord had not commanded this. He was just his own personal whim to know how many people there were in his tribes now. So the Lord is mad, and the Lord says, all right, David, you can pick which of these three punishments you want. Do you want to have a famine that lasts for so many days? Or do you want your enemies to pursue you for so many days? Or do you want to have pestilence strike the people of Israel for 3 days? Well, 3 days was less than any of the others. And it's God who's in charge of pestilence, not man. And so David chooses 3 days of pestilence. So God sends his angel of death, who brings pestilence upon the people of Israel. They start dying. And the angel of death is just about to go into Jerusalem, and God stops him. He says, stop now. We're not going to go to Jerusalem. And go tell David instead to build me an altar on the threshing floor of this particular person. And so David goes, he buys the threshing floor, he buys the oxen, he sacrifices to Yahweh and builds the altar, and the pestilence stops. And we will have some more of these stories as we start First Kings. And it's just kind of long stories about the royal succession and the things that happen to the king. Now, last week, for those of you who stayed around for the after recording session, Dewey asked, how do the Old Testament stories bring me closer to God? And I wasn't going to do it because Father Scalia, remember I told you, go watch Father Scalia's talking about God in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Father Scalia is brilliant. I am not brilliant. But when Dewey asked me that question about how can these stories possibly bring us closer to God, it reminded me of Father Scalia's 1-hour lecture. So I'm going to summarize it here in just a few minutes. He made 5 points about how the Old Testament brings us closer to Jesus in the New Testament. And his first point was that there is continuity and discontinuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He said the New Testament is concealed in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is revealed in the New Testament. And Christ knows this, right? Christ knows and fulfills the Old Testament perfectly. He quotes from it all the time in the New Testament. Jesus knows his scriptures, the scriptures of the Old Testament, and he brings them up again and again. And in fact, our resurrected Lord goes out on the road to Emmaus with his disciples, and he actually explains to them how the Old Testament relates to him, how he was the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So he knows it perfectly. But the New Testament must be new. When God, Jesus, reveals his face to us. His face is the face of a man of suffering. And now he's drawn close to us. He was this faraway God, this Yahweh, I am who am, that was kind of total mystery, but now he's come to earth. But he's come to earth as a man of suffering, not as a great soldier. That's what Israel was expecting. They expected their anointed one to basically be a great leader who was going to conquer the whole world for them, and they were going to reign forever. And Father Scalia gave John the Baptist as an example of somebody who had to accept this new testament, this new gospel, and change his worldview. So there's the continuity, the oldness of Jesus being prophesied in the Old Testament. And then there's the New Testament where he really reveals who he is. So that brings us closer to him. Father Scalia pointed out that there's divine simplicity. We think of God as human. God is not human. God doesn't have any parts. He sees without eyes. He hears without ears. He is infinitely and perfectly simple. We as human beings, we separate power and mercy. God does not. God is way, way, way above us. But he deigns to come down and be with us. But when he does, he ends up humbling us. He feeds us. And as a man disciplines his son, God disciplines human beings. And so we see that in the Old Testament. We see God disciplining his sons so that he can bring them into the incarnation of himself, of his son, Jesus Christ. Father Scalia said that divine pedagogy, which means training or education, God teaching us, that he teaches us differently according to our capacities. And the capacity of people 4,000 years ago is way different than our capacity today, or the capacity of the people 2,000 years away from Abraham. And one of the examples that Father gave was that polygamy and divorce were allowed in the Old Testament. But after the grace, the superabundant grace that Jesus has given us by dying on the cross, that grace changes everything. That now we have the grace to be faithful to the one husband or the one wife that he gives us. That we are no longer allowed to have divorces. And Father Scalia said that the events of the Old Testament were written as a warning to us. A type trailer, right? You see trailers of movies where it's kind of a summary. Well, the Old Testament is a trailer of what is to come. The church is the spiritual kingdom that God gave us until Christ comes again. We who are part of the church are the new Israel. But the story's end is still to come. And God has also trained us for that story that is to come. And Father pointed out that the divine mystery, recognizing it and realizing that we can never fully understand God, that we have to read the Bible with eyes of faith and with hearts of faith, because we can't understand God's continuity. And if you have a Catechism of the Catholic Church, go to paragraph 206. It's kind of the story of God or the paragraph explaining God as he reveals his name, I am who am. Father Scalia pointed out that there's always going to be an element of mystery about God. We can never fully understand him. And when we ask the question, why doesn't God make things more transparent so we just get it? Why didn't he write this as a recipe book? Why parables? Well, Christ tells us why God does that. He does it to confound the proud. We must be willing to be taught, but also keep the mystery in God, trusting instead of solving God. And if we don't do that, if we don't trust him, if we don't understand that we're not going to understand every single thing that's in the Bible, and it's not going to give us the total answer of God who is so far beyond us, if we think that we can solve God, we turn into scientists, right? We don't want faith, we want proof. We want to go back and show, oh, well, look, there's a historical problem right here. Here's a historical problem right here. Oh, this is just a myth. Can't do that. There's the divine mystery. And without that faith, and it's one of the things that comes from the Old Testament, is recognizing how faith is rewarded by God. And finally, Father talked about the punishment that awaits. Revelation, which is the last book of the New Testament, is the book of unveiling. That's what Revelation means. It means unveiling. And we are already in the end times. We entered the end times as soon as Christ was resurrected and ascended back into heaven. We entered into the end times. The punishment of those that cross God awaits. And it is severe. When we aren't going to study the book of Revelation, but if you want to understand, right, we always talk about, oh, the Old Testament is this angry God, and how can we be close to this angry God? How does this make us closer to him? Well, because when we read the book of Revelation from chapter 14 onward, we see that at the end times, that God will require that we are either for him or we are against him. It's really a control issue. That's what original sin was, that has affected us so deeply. It's a control issue. We want to control God. And with our last breath, he allows us, even until then, to say, God, I love you. Jesus died on the cross for me because I am a great sinner, but I want to come. I want to be with you forever, and I will follow your rules in heaven. I will be totally subservient to you. You will be my God, and I will be the soul that follows you and does whatever you want, just like the angels do. Well, the Old Testament is a type. We talk of types, right? Like David is a type of Jesus. Isaac is a type of Jesus. We have types of Mary, Miriam in the Old Testament. We can look at Ruth as a type of Mary. Well, the Old Testament is a type of the retribution that will come when Jesus comes again in his glory. And so that brings us closer to God. It should put this reverence of God in our hearts, that he is a God of love, and he is a God of mercy. Love, or mercy, is love that goes beyond justice, right? And he will do that. We can, there's a great story of Therese of Lisieux. She wanted to pray for a prisoner that had committed terrible, terrible murders, and he was going to be guillotined. But she told her sister, who was already a nun, she said she wanted to pray for this particular prisoner, and she was going to ask God to forgive him. And she was going to trust that even if the prisoner showed no sign of retribution at the end of his life, she was going to trust that God would listen to her and would have mercy on the soul of this murderer. So the murderer he refuses to take a last confession from the priest, and he refuses to be blessed by the priest, and he walks to the guillotine, And at the last moment, he asks for the crucifix, he kisses it, and then he has his head chopped off. And Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, was so happy because she got this sign from God that yes, this soul would be saved. He would be in heaven, and someday she would meet him there, right? But not everybody's going to do that. Some people will not give up control. They would never be happy and in heaven because they would want to be in control. And it's those people that Satan will convince to come and be in hell with him. And so that's kind of how the stories of the Old Testament bring me closer to the God of the New Testament, to Jesus Christ, right? Anyway, so for next week, I'm so proud of you guys for hanging in there. We are ready to start First Kings, and I sent you the syllabus already in PDF format, so you can print out the rest of the week's readings, and these will be included on them. But next week we'll cover First Kings chapters 1 through 22, but I broke them into two sections here because chapter 1 through 11 are about the United Kingdom while it's still held together. Chapters 12 through 22 are about the divided kingdom because part of the tribes are going to break away from the other part. And so you're going to now get two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And so that's why I broke them like this. And then, as usual, I've given you my picks so that if you don't want to read all 22 chapters, here are some of the key chapters right here. So with that, I'm ready to stop sharing and to stop recording.